Grand. Well, thank you for the hush in the room. It's very good to see so many people still here. Normally on these occasions, the room is half empty, but I guess it's the draw of the Secretary of State coming after me, which is why we're all still here. But it's been a great couple of days, much food for thought. We've learned a lot, not least that Bob Bruce would be a great game show host. But seriously, thank you all for your contribution, and particularly to the last session, the panel from ACSC, which I would observe was an innovation, and an innovation that I think we should repeat each year. And I would observe that whilst there was a lot of applause to Nick English's observation about innovation, without that innovation, Nick, you wouldn't have been on the stage. But being serious again for a moment, I mean, Nick makes a fair point, because what he does is to highlight the tension associated with the speed of change and how we make sure that the golf club that we're effectively swinging doesn't mean that the units at the bottom end, where the head of the club is, are moving at a rapid rate. We need to make sure we control the rate at which it occurs. I think the conference has confirmed that adaptation, though, is essential, particularly given the changing character of conflict. It's also, I think, observed that there are some significant obstacles to it. And I think we've learned some of the ways that we might overcome those obstacles. First, I think we need to think hard about creating the right culture where debate, constructive dissent, and challenge is encouraged. As Tim Harford put it, disagreement is where adaptation starts. Creating the opportunity, either in training or through experimentation, where honest mistakes can be made. Next, I think, it also tells us that treating early engagements in a campaign as a reconnaissance is probably quite a sensible way of looking at the beginning of a campaign. It teaches us a bit about making honest mistakes and learning from them. And I was very struck by Herman Narula's observation of celebrating failure, of course, providing that it's based on a logical foundation. Creating a flat information environment in which feedback can be received, particularly from the generation that matters. Making sure the right lessons can be learned and applied. Elliot Cohen's Ghosts. And of course, his point of view about rotating headquarters throughout Iraq and Afghanistan as an annual frontal lobotomy, I think, provides food for thought. And particularly from our perspective as a nation who cycle people through every 6 months, did we not learn the right lesson from Northern Ireland that the continuity vested in those permanent brigade headquarters perhaps gave us the ability to be able to achieve the effect we needed to achieve? But notwithstanding this idea of a flat information environment, you still need a hierarchy of decision-making and a means to assure that those decisions are being implemented. And again, I was struck by Paul Newton's observation about even as the three-star empowered to do this, he couldn't yet translate it all the way down the chain of command. And I think this tells us something about having to organize for adaptation, both in terms of structure and process. And importantly, a theme I shall return to, how you have to incentivize people to do it. I think we learned a lot about the real risk of groupthink, and that's a point that's particularly relevant to conservative institutions like ours. I remember being asked by a clever student at the Staff College, shortly after I'd done Army 2020, whether I had been as radical as I wanted to be. And my answer to him was, it's very easy to be radical if you're not in charge. And of course, loss aversion, the point that was made by the panel yesterday, the criticism I sense that was so often levelled, probably unfairly, at World War I generals. And diversity is essential if you're going to overcome this notion of groupthink, and thus the importance of maximising talent, a theme I shall return to. And I think my last big point in terms of what I've deduced from this is that commanders and leaders who recognise the importance of humility and the importance of listening and learning are vital to our future. So what to the British Army and where we go from here? I talked yesterday about our evolving force structure. I talked about it being designed to be adaptable and versatile. And there is a distinction in those two words. It's got to be able to adjust to new circumstances, but it's also got to have an adequate range of capability that can be optimized specifically. And that's why Army 2020 distinguished between the role of 3 UK Div, essentially the heart of our divisional level capability to warfight, from that of one div, which is very much optimized for this persistent engagement overseas. I talked about strike brigades and specialized infantry battalions. I talked about our intention to develop one ISR brigade and 77 brigade, along with our signals brigades, into an information maneuver formation. I talked about a more productive force preparation system that should also allow more time at unit level to learn and reduce friction in terms of the way that we do this. It's really important, this, to buy more time at that level, and I shall return to that theme. But we do have to work at versatility. We have some acknowledged capability shortfalls as a result of 10 years of campaigning in a counterinsurgency context, namely air defense, CEMA, combined arms understanding, and our ability to fight in complex terrain, particularly the urban environment. And I talked about the Army Reserve component and the Army Regular Reserve. But we have definitely got further work to do on reconstitution, regeneration, and generally being able to expand the Army when we need it. I also talked about the operating model, and I talked about decision-making being focused on the right horizon. We are trying to distinguish clearly between fight tonight, which is very much the business of the Field Army Commander, and it's his job to try and prevent the Field Army getting too worried about the future and the change, because that's what happens in the Army headquarters. And there's got to be the distinction between fighting tonight and fighting to tomorrow, because otherwise we won't implement the change in a way that is manageable within the Army as a whole. For the first time, we have an Army strategy. That strategy takes account of the fact that last autumn we did an audit of the amount of change going on in the Army, and we discovered there were plus of 350 change initiatives, of which probably only 10% on a good day were resourced. We now adopt a portfolio management, the way in which we are going to execute that strategy through 10 key lines of operation or strategic programs. And this acknowledges the pace that the change has got to occur at, my point about a golf club and how fast you swing it at the bottom. We don't yet have a flat information system, nor a culture within our chain of command that is confident, and I would suggest open-minded enough to encourage innovation or experimentation. And I don't think our chain of command is yet comfortable with trying to allocate the time and space that the panel before lunch talked about. I think our CHASER, our Centre for Historical Analysis and Conflict Research, is a step in the right direction to a learning culture, and the role that ACOS warfare and ACOS training have played during the latter stages of the Afghan campaign and continue to play at our Land Warfare Centre, with lessons learned at the heart of what they do. But I was very struck by Mir Finkel's observation that you have to set a time on the process. He talked about 24 hours. Well, maybe. It is about agility, and it's about tempo, but of course it's about tempo in relation to your opponent, and I think, therefore, time has to be measured carefully. We have to also institutionalize force development, I think building on the platform that, in fact, Paul Newton re-established when he was a 3-star in the Army, involving the Field Army more than we do in this force development. The fielding of strike is an opportunity for us to experiment and to develop concepts and doctrine in front of the equipment arriving. Developing concept demonstrators with industry to pull them off the shelf when we need to adapt at pace. And this plays back into the operating model. And I absolutely acknowledge the point of the notion of networks and communities of interest. And the sort of thing you saw before lunch is undoubtedly a means to achieve a community of interest that can cycle feedback information to the levels that we need. We should, though, also widen the aperture. I think there's much more that we should be doing in terms of learning and development on a multinational basis. I talked about interoperability yesterday and our bilateral and multilateral relationships. But these should be used far more to share best practice in a systematic and experimental way than we currently do. But it's also about our relationship with the outside world, and in particular with industry. And do we, when we contract for a solution, think about innovation? Do we think about how we can achieve that effect from our industry partners? Invariably, all we think about are KPIs. We don't think about how we can encourage the innovation that industry should bring to us, because that is the offset strategy that we need to work on, I would suggest. Part of the problem, of course, is as an organization, it's challenging to incentivize creativity and innovation. We clearly need, as Kirsten Marlane observed yesterday, a stable backbone. But we need to find a means of rewarding innovators, creating the space for some mavericks, people who are prepared to take sensible intellectual risks and to challenge received wisdom. And I'm not sure that our talent management system allows for this, with so much importance attached to what the superior officer writes. Maybe we should be privileging some other attributes than those listed in the existing appraisal system and appraisal report. We need to think hard about how we train. We need to think about our training incorporating tactical innovation. And I subscribe to the view the panel expressed before lunch about force-on-force training, because that forces a competition and thus it forces tactical innovation. And I saw that repeatedly in Afghanistan, where the better battle group commanders in Sangin were thinking about how they could outwit their opponent rather than just simply taking the blows that he gave to them. We need to think about where we train and the environment in which we train. And the urban emphasis fell out of yesterday big time. And whether we get into partnership with the Germans in Letzlinger Heide or the French in Sonzub, it matters not. But the British Army does not spend nearly enough time thinking about complex terrain and urban environments. We have to find the time, the space, and the manning resilience in our force preparation to encourage honest mistakes. And I suspect you don't have to spend millions on collective training to achieve that effect. And, as we wrote in the Leadership Code, leaders must tolerate risk and accept honest mistakes as a natural part of leader development. Part of the theme around this conference has been maximising talent, and there are some important points to make about it. I touched yesterday on the point about squeezing the maximum utility out of all of our manpower. And given our size nowadays, we need to be thinking of an end strength of 120,000, combining all types of manpower, so that we focus on its output and think of it as a capability, not an overhead. I'd emphasize that point. We need to think about manpower as a capability and not as an overhead. I also touched, in part, about how we make the most of all of the talent that we currently have serving in the regular component and the reserve component, as well as our wider workforce. Because this is an offset strategy for not having so many full-time employees as we might have had in the past. It includes many who are not currently considered part of the Army's trained strength, who nevertheless have a level of training and discipline that would allow them to support the types of national resilience tasks described in our STSR. We therefore, in the future, plan to use what we currently call Phase 1 trained personnel as trained soldiers in response to crises within the UK, increasing the size of the force available in the event of a national emergency. This will result in soldiers contributing more and earlier in their careers, particularly important for the reserve component, and therefore feeling more motivated and more valued. This will increase the pool of manpower available by around 3,000 to 5,000 in the regular component and around 1,800 as at today in the reserve component. Trained strength will now include all armed forces personnel trained in the core function of their service. And for the Army, this means you're a soldier once you've completed what we currently call Phase 1 training. The commitment confirmed in the SDSR to 82,000 regular roles will not change. And because we want to gain even more utility from the Army Reserve, we will look to expand its strength to around 32,000 by the end of the next epoch. Now, just to assure Nick Gowing that I'm listening, I'm going to talk a bit now about a brains-based approach. What we need to do as an army, and we've talked much about it, is to place intellectual rigor at the heart of our decision-making. We need to identify the trends through analysis of credible evidence, and we need to apply science to what we do. It's shaming that the Army, 15 years ago, got rid of its human science research capability. We have to have that if we're genuinely going to be able to inform the future. And we have to have it in order to determine innovative and imaginative solutions for tomorrow's challenges. That's one of the reasons why we've reinvigorated the idea of a general staff. And yes, it's going to have and has a corporate approach and uniformity. And yes, to the observant ones yesterday, I had the wrong buttons on. But seriously, it's about greater unity of effort, and it's about having a corporate voice as an army. It's about suspending tribalism at the regimental level and making sure as an army we speak with one confident voice. That's why we have a new General Staff Centre at the Robertson House, the former Army Staff College building at Sandhurst. That's why we have an annual General Staff Conference where the big idea is aired and then we go forth and multiply. It's about a new General Staff induction course and a new generalship programme that recognises the challenges of modern generalship. But it's also about opportunities for continuous professional and personal development. We now require people on the General Staff to apply for jobs, to explain what their credentials are for why they should do a particular appointment. It's about external placements. The key is to ensure that these opportunities are valued by the HR system. The linkage to study and to promotion is just one of the options that we're scoping. And we must make sure that the Army properly harnesses the knowledge, skills, and experience that these sorts of people will bring to the Army. For example, we now have a CGS Fellow at Chatham House and a full-time doctoral research programme in partnership with King's College. But the extent to which those people are valued when they return to the career structure is something we have to reinforce. They shouldn't be taking a risk through attending it. We've also got a major on empowerment, slightly unattractive term, but I'll explain what I'm talking about. We need to try and create the conditions in which our culture of mission command applies in peacetime as well as it does in wartime. We need to recognise, as is written at the front end of the Army Leadership Code, that over-assurance has no place on the battlefield, and it must not in peacetime either. This is not about encouraging recklessness, it is about accepting errors in the pursuit of sensible risk-taking, boldness, and initiative. You have to seize those fleeting opportunities on the battlefield if you're going to succeed. But to pick up on Kieran Sheldon's point, oddly enough, ECAB took a paper, that's the Executive Committee of the Army Board, only 10 days ago, on assurance, because the Army Inspector has conducted a review, as directed by the Army Board, to get after the extent to which we've had this incremental growth in assurance process, which has led, I sense, to too much friction down the chain of command. And of course, what's needed is an audit to stop that assurance. So like an octopus, it doesn't extend its tentacles into all of what we do. We need to understand what the policy costs us, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time. And you'll find, oh, commanding officers, that your assurance problem will be reduced by some 60% during the course of the next year or so. We also, though, going back to my point about empowerment, need to cascade the effect that defence reform has given to me as a top-level budget holder further down the chain of command. And we will initiate a series of pilots over the course of the next 3 months, whereby at school and unit level, and in functional terms, commanders and leaders are given the opportunity to imagine that they play with all of their resources. And through a process of virtual bank accounting at TLB level, we will unlock their potential to innovate and to think about how they can run things in a more productive and cost-informed way. We are also going to modernise our career structure. Flexible engagements were announced in the Defence Review. This is about making it possible for everyone with the potential to serve a full career and to maximise everyone's potential accordingly. It's about removing unnecessary constraints and timelines in the career structure. It's about getting after how we conduct career and personnel management. It's about also how we structure the career. We need time in the career to build knowledge, skills, and experience, and to encourage leaders to think for the longer term. We also need to privilege learning and have the time to privilege learning. And I'm going to re-quote Eric Hoffer, the quote I used yesterday. Education should implant a will and a facility for learning. It should produce not learned, but learning people. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And if we can encourage that to happen, then this idea of adaptability and innovation will come forth. And we need fundamentally to look at the balance between generalists and specialists. And that, I sense, will open up the potential for lateral entry And I think that will open up the potential for greater diversity of views to get after groupthink. Finally, on maximising potential, we have got to create the inclusive climate that was referred to earlier. And of course, this is about encouraging that diversity. We've got, as an institution, to broaden our recruiting base. We've got to reach out to communities that we've not traditionally recruited from. We have to do this partly because our own recruiting base, the traditional one we pull people from, is shrinking. It's about getting after communities like Black, Asian, minority, ethnic. But it's also those with a future in the specialist areas that I talked about, and therefore encouraging this idea of lateral entry. And it's about maximising the potential of the 51% of the population that we don't tap into nearly enough at the moment. We need to be better at explaining the benefits of the military career, the education it offers, and the apprenticeships. We've got some great recent role models. Kidane Kauslan, for example, who was a student at AFC Harrogate, who recently won the Sword of Honour at Sandhurst. But fundamentally, as an institution, we have to keep looking to get after our culture. And we have a culture, I'm afraid, with too much unacceptable behaviour, often alcohol-induced, and that has to be resolved. The Army Leadership Code gets after this, and it gets after a desire to make sure that our leaders live by our values and standards. But we've got to be transparent about it. It's only by transparency, I think, that people will genuinely realise that we are an employer who values everybody. We have to recognise, for leaders who are seeking to do this, that we live in a goldfish bowl. And we have to be prepared, I think perhaps through Tim Harford's idea of failure fairs, to acknowledge worst and best practice. There is, I'm afraid, a fine line between encouraging fighting spirit and stifling it. So, in conclusion, I think what I have drawn from the last couple of days is that there is a need to adapt. It's inevitable. And for us as an institution, I think that means we have to emphasise the importance of learning, particularly from our mistakes, and learning the right lessons. James Sladden's observation about unknown knowns. I think we have to emphasise the value of trial and error, experimentation, feedback, and a flat information environment that enables tempo and agility. We have to emphasise the creation of an environment and a culture in which leaders are prepared to allow honest mistakes in the pursuit of calculated risk-taking on the battlefield. And finally, I think we have to emphasise the importance of leaders who have humility and are prepared to listen and thus learn. We're now going to do